Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I know it's been a long day. Can I just see, just from a show of hands, how many people have been here since the morning or the majority of the day and have survived? Thank you very much. We should applaud you. And how many have come specially for this panel? Can I have it? Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, so we have a serious issue that we're contending with this afternoon, countering human trafficking and modern slavery. And I'm delighted to be joined by a distinguished panel. And the compelling part of this afternoon, I think, will be, and we're all agreed, is the interaction with each other. So before I introduce the panel, perhaps I can read some facts out that states the scene and establish the scene as to what we're dealing with in some ways. So according to the most conservative estimates by the UN, almost 21 million people worldwide are victims of forced labor. 21 million. This is according to conservative figures. The Modern Slavery Index, which is another report, because it's notorious, you'll appreciate it's really hard to estimate really how many people are in forced labor. You have to be fairly smart in your predictive analysis. But according to another index, in 2016, the other figure is that there are 45.8 million people who are in some form of modern slavery in 167 countries, and this is according to the Modern Slavery Index that was done by Gallup and other polls. If that is true, then that is the highest number of, so at no time in history have there been more slaves than now. So that's more than the entire transatlantic slave trade and other things. So, but I'll go with the UN figures, if I may. Of those exploited by individuals or enterprises, 4.5 million are victims of forced sexual exploitation. Forced labor in the private economy generates a total of $150 billion in illegal profits per year. This is a well-known estimate. In the UK, in 2015, 3,266 people were identified as potential victims of trafficking. This is a 40% increase on the 2014 figures. Of the 3,266 potential victims of trafficking reported and identified in 2015, 982 of these were children. Victims are men, women, and children of all ages, ethnicities, and nationalities, and cut across the population. However, it is normally more prevalent amongst the most vulnerable or within minority or socially excluded groups. This is in Britain. Approximately 53% of victims in the UK are women, and 46% are men. Child victims are victims of child abuse and should therefore be treated as such using child protection procedures and statutory protocols. Potential victims have been reported in this country from 103 different countries of origin. And in Britain, the top 6 most common countries of origin for potential victims of trafficking in 2015 were Albania, Vietnam, Nigeria, Romania, and Poland. And we were talking about Syria. According to the index on slavery, the top 5 countries are North Korea with 1,100,000 people estimated in slavery, Uzbekistan, Cambodia, India, Qatar. And then number 6, there are estimates as to who's vying for the 6th position, but since we were talking about Syria this morning, Syria is number 6 in the index, with 1.13% of the entire population estimated as in slavery. And and of a population of about 23,257,300 people. 257,300 people in slavery. So this is a very harrowing, I must confess that I did not know these figures. These are very harrowing figures. And together, let's figure out. I was searching for statistics for London, because 50% of all trafficked people in the UK come through London. So within a 1-mile radius of this building, there will be slaves today. But the figures aren't available. So can I introduce, with that, on that serious note, can I introduce our panel? Charles Bennett, you know, he's the director of the European Atlantic Group, and in his work he has come across this phenomenon in the examination and analysis of international issues. This is a prime amos. Next to him is Verity Marshall. Now, Verity is was a humanitarian volunteer on the island of Samos. She's an actor, and she represents, in many ways, the thinking of an ordinary person who says, look, what can I do about this situation? So she does not profess to be an expert on this issue, but she volunteered. She got out and did something and spent a month where she came to terms or saw trafficking and slavery en masse. At the end is Dr. Amit Mukherjee, who gave the opening this morning. He's a consultant orthopedic surgeon, somebody who is well known in India in the management field as well. But he has come across the abuses in the rural context, around Jamshedpur, where Tata Steel operates, and beyond. And as his patients, he gives a lot of his time voluntarily to his patients, and he has seen the effects of slavery there. And as I say, India is the third largest country, where 19 million people are in bonded labor and as slaves. And to my left is Anjali Rauf, who is the chief executive officer and founder of Making Her Story. And so part of her job is dealing with victims of slavery and working with women who have been abused. And she runs regular trips to Calais and other refugee centers, and is of this panel the person who has, I think, the most direct, ongoing experience of this issue. So what I suggest we'll do is, if I can ask, if we could start with from my right, and ask the panelists to introduce themselves. So I know you've heard from Charles Bennett before, but introduce themselves personally, who they are, and why this affects them, and then something about their perspective or stance on this position. We'll go through the panel that way, and then we'll have a question answer. Is that okay? All right, Charles. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I claim no particular expertise or direct knowledge of the human trafficking at this end of the route. Apologies for those who've had to listen to me before. I was a soldier briefly in the police in Zimbabwe till 1983, a soldier again, various other work in East and Central Africa, continuing work in Northern Ireland for political and community relations nature, subsequently work in Iraq and much more in Afghanistan until 2007, various election monitoring experience in Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan and elsewhere. My particular interest in Afghanistan, as some of you had to put up with before, and in various parts of Eastern and Southern Africa still. My basic premise is that without thinking that it's right or possible to abdicate responsibility for refugees in the terms that Jonathan Weller's referred to before, that the pure scale of the problem we're dealing with now cannot be dealt with merely by easing the passage of refugees and I do think there's a difference between a refugee and a migrant, but I don't think it's a either-or classification. I think there's a whole scale of things. Economic migrants could include European settlers who went around the world, people who go somewhere to better themselves. Many other people come in the other direction. Not necessarily people who are suffering, who people want to better themselves, but equally there are economic refugees, people whose financial survival circumstances are inadequate, so are forced to move, and people forced to move by war, and then, as Jonathan referred to earlier, the people who fit the very narrow definition of refugees, who are, as groups or individuals, subject to persecution. Now, once people are in a very limited sense in a place of safety, that in traditional legal terms ends their status as refugees. But of course, it can't be as simple as that, and I'm afraid I missed part of the earlier discussion, but clearly situations like Syria, if we're referring to that in particular, with the best will in the world, we can't hope that these problems will be resolved in the short term. And again, Afghanistan, this has been going on for 30 years or so. I would say I feel very strongly that often forgotten are internally displaced people, who are actually usually the people who are worse off and usually still at threat. These are people who haven't even escaped the immediate threat to life or survival. And of course, are usually those who in material terms are worse off, because those are the people who can't even afford to pay often extortionate sums to people traffickers or make their way by other means to safer and more desirable countries. I do believe strongly that we need, this is going back a bit on what was said in the earlier session, it's not satisfactory to leave people dumped in refugee camps, so it only endorsed thoroughly everything that was being said about making use of the human talents of the people concerned themselves, not just from a practical point of view, but from a human and moral point of view. And I think that's something which we need to do much more. A country like Jordan particularly has done a huge amount, but is actually under huge stress, and the relative population figures, I think, speak for that. It's not, however, simply a solution to try and block routes, and I don't think it's an acceptable way to select people who might be lucky enough to get to this country by saying you do a sort of murderous international obstacle course to get here, and if you survive traffickers in the Sahara and traffickers to get to the Mediterranean, and then you're not one of the whatever hideously large proportion it is who are drowned, then by luck of survival, you're the person who should be allowed to stay here. And though I would have a lot of other disagreements with the current government, I think the British government's current stance has a lot to recommend it, because I think that there are people who, beyond the initial responsibility to protect that we have in terms of what we failed to do in Rwanda when we weren't there, and what we failed to do in the Balkans when we were there, there's a longer term responsibility to protect both people under vulnerable people, and particular people or groups under particular risk of continued persecution. You can't make a clear distinction between all these groups, of course. Somalia, people flee, lots of Somalis flee Somalia in the south because they're victims of war, because there is continuing conflict there. I haven't been there, but Somaliland in the north is a marvellously peaceful country, so they don't have the problems that most Somalis have. However, even before they had the worst drought in living memory last year, people are simply fleeing because they have a growing young population, nothing for them to do, so understandably they want to go elsewhere. And many of these people who risk their lives by drowning, whether or not they're aware of the risk in advance, I'm not always sure, they may be, they may not be, are understandably wanting to better their lives, not because they're under immediate threat, simply because they see no other hope at all.
It's 5 minutes, 30
Sorry.
seconds. Yeah. No, that's fine, that's good. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to remind the panel when they go to 5 minutes, so they can go on. beyond that if they want.
No.
Verity, please.
Thank you. Hi, I volunteered in Samos, which is one of the Aegean islands through which refugees travel to reach. I'm so sorry. Off to a bad start. So yes, I volunteered for a period last year on one of the Aegean islands, where Lesbos is obviously where most of the refugees travel from Turkey. But Samos, which has at its shortest distance actually just a kilometre for them to cross the water, obviously became a popular route. Maybe as to be expected, that was closed off quite quickly, and then a 14-kilometre route was used by the smugglers who took them across. And this, as everybody knows, is an enormously hazardous, perilous journey. And so I travelled with ironic ease and speed to Samos to do whatever I could to help. From what I was seeing, and to the people I was speaking to, there's no evidence of, economic migrant. These were people who were telling the most horrendous stories that until you hear it firsthand, you don't believe they exist, and with such regularity, people my exact equivalent, someone my exact age with my same educational background, telling me of the things that they'd seen and the reasons they'd had to leave, not just because they wanted to continue their studies, they had to leave because they'd been asked to shoot their own brother, or they would be shot themselves, and these awful, awful stories. So we were there to distribute the donations that had just started coming in. A few weeks before I arrived, they weren't so lucky. Lots of people were dying of hypothermia. This was obviously the winter, and they are all going to be soaking wet when they arrive, whether or not they have actually been submerged. The water is, splashing around them. And often people would arrive minus family members. So best case scenario is you're freezing, and we can warm them up and give them food. But often it's not that lucky, and that there's terrible fatalities along the way. I heard a story of a dad who kept the child's body afloat, but didn't want to lift the child onto the boat because the mother would see and she would give up all hope. So kept this body hanging along for the last bit of their journey. So the Syrians are granted immediate asylum, whereas Somalians and Afghanis, the Kurds aren't. It's a bit more complex, so they are sent to a detention centre in a remote part of the island, which we weren't given access to. We weren't allowed to distribute aid there. Eventually, we were able to give a Nutella sandwich to each child once a day, but that was all. And these places are really quite deplorable conditions without us being able to do any more. So anyway, I got to speak obviously firsthand to a lot of people, and they would describe their route, and once they arrive in Turkey, it's, as I imagine it is, at the tuk-tuk stand in India, with everyone trying to make their bid that you should pick them as their trafficker. They then say to meet you at a certain place, but obviously it's got to be remote, it's got to be in the dead of night. A long 2-hour hike through a forest to a remote peninsula of Turkey, where you will set off on your makeshift, aged dinghy, which is, you have to wait for a long time until it's chock-a-block, because they don't want to waste their lovely dinghy. And you're given a life jacket, but your life jacket probably has newspaper in it, because it's probably been used a lot of times, and they want to fob you off with this feeble thing. And then you make your journey, and you aren't supported. Ibrahim, who was my translator when I was there, told me that he was certainly under the impression that his trafficker was going to come along for the journey, even if they were collected by a jet ski halfway through. He never came, and they don't know how to steer, and they don't know what island they're going to hit. And when they hit Samos, they certainly don't hit the port where they need to register. So they then, soaking wet and bereaved, have to travel across to register, where they're told they're just a number, and they get sent to a detention centre where they face further hardships. I could only contribute for the time I had available, and I'm phenomenally glad that I did. But and I understand this is not we can't just keep going this way. There needs to be a sort of more geopolitical solution to this. But I would say what I learned is, as Joe Cox said, there's much more that unites us than divides us. And if people can not dissociate from these people, you would all do exact same thing. I mean, if people are coming to better their lives, they are making a huge sacrifices to do so, and that should be acknowledged, respected, and do as we would be done by, I think, in this instance.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Verity. Can you just tell me, by way of just introduction to yourself, what motivated you to, as a young person, to volunteer? Was it the images you saw? Was it some personal contact you had? Was it an ongoing interest, abiding interest of yours?
No, I think it's, as I have tried to advocate, I think time of it, the people on the ground is so essential in these places. I was one of 9 volunteers to what was at its height 7,000 refugees who were backed up because the ferry was striking, and so no ferries were taking them on, so that people would arrive and not be able to move on. And there were just 9 of us who were all people who had met on Facebook and said, I have a bit of time, can I help? And went. I was lucky enough to have that time. But, and now anyone who had a day, 2 days, they're so needed, because although people are being fabulous and sending money and sending clothes, these need to be so quickly distributed because of the constant turnover of people who urgently need these clothes.
So a need was expressed on Facebook?
I had imagined there would be a need, and therefore I put the feelers out on social media, which has been an amazing tool for this. Everybody I met there had, found each other that way.
Thank you, Verity. Dr. Mukherjee, would you like to tell us, please, a bit more about yourself? But how do you start?
Am I audible?
Yeah, there you go.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let me just tell you, I am basically an orthopedic surgeon working in India, in the eastern part of India. And though I had heard about trafficking in a big way in the country, like what he just says, that we are the 3rd in the world, and I was aware that our trafficking consisted of 2 types. One within the country, where people were trafficked within the country to places where they were needed, and out of the country, where they were maimed, made blind, and then used as beggars in, Anjali just told me, even in the Middle East, and to ride camels and stuff like that. So it was so real, but I had never really been part of it until I took over a hospital in a rural area, and then I started to hear all the stories around. And then I realized that that area of the country was one of the worst for human trafficking. And I was not even aware. I was living just 10 kilometers away from there. Until some parents came and said they lost their child. He was there in the morning, they couldn't find him anymore. So we tried to go to the police, we tried to go to the authorities, nobody would help, and they would be so helpless. They would not know how to retrieve their children. So that's when I first realized what was happening. And then I realized that, we had to really look at what was happening. And we realized that there was this demand in a place of the country where all this was needed, especially for people who wanted very inexpensive labor in their homes, in their farms. There were people who wanted to be incorporated into their armies, the mafia, the Maoists who wanted each family had to give 1 child, to them, and that was quite open. And then, of course, prostitution was again a very common, and even for begging and drug peddling. So that was a kind of demand for such people. You see, these would be made blind or maimed, put on the streets to beg, or they would be part of a drug peddling group. So these were the demands for it. And where was the supply coming from? You see, stark poverty. They didn't know what to do, they didn't have any job, so what did? They fall prey to such touts who would come and say, well, we'll give you a job, please come with us. And there would be no job at the end of it, there would just be slavery. And then, or at the end of it, they would have, them maimed and even transported out of the country. Then they would be, you see, in some states of the country, and again in our area, women are looked down upon just as some people who are not earning at all, who would just do some menial work and then had to get married. So they are they have to be moved out, and if in the process I get some money for it, I'm very happy. So I happily sell my daughter away, which is a tragedy there. And then, of course, kidnapping. A huge amount of kidnapping was taking place in the area, and they were being taken away, nobody knew where, and they would end up, So we were wondering what we could do about it. And I thought that there was no way we could just keep quiet and not do anything about it. So what we decided is that we would make people aware of it, not only in the populace, but in the administration, in the government, in everybody, to say this is a reality. And I'm so happy to say our Prime Minister himself the other day, just last week, I think, said that this is one of the great issues in the country, and we need to locate all these people who have just gone out of the radar. So it's now being pointed out. The other thing I thought is better governance, better administration. If the governance, if the police, if the administration are doing their own thing better, we will be able to track down these people who are actually doing it for money. And we will have a much better way to do it. The other thing I think is poverty alleviation and creating jobs in the rural areas. For example, I believe very strongly that I cannot go on cursing the darkness. I would rather light one small lamp wherever I can. So in my small little hospital, I've gone around to all the villages there to say, which are the girls who would like to be trained as nurses? And I've taken them on. I've found people who would also give them a little stipend, and we are training them for a year. We'll make them employable and also give them the dignity. Otherwise, they would, in their own villages, they would have no dignity at all. Now, I send them back to their villages twice a week with an apron, with a stethoscope, with something, and you can imagine their stature rise in the same places. So in whatever little way we can, I think if each one of us uses our own intelligence and inspiration, we could play a part in bringing this down.
Thank you very much. So Anjali, if you just want to take the mic, and please do start with an introduction to yourself.
Hi everyone. As Chris said, my name is Anjali Ralph, and I'm the founder and CEO of Making Her Story. We are a human rights mobilization unit, and I use the word human rights very purposefully, even though our remit is to concentrate on helping women and girls around the world break free from abuse, enslavement, trafficking in all its forms. Our work with regards to trafficking and abuse, and the reason why I set up Making Her Story only 3 years ago, it is very personal. I'm going to talk about it very briefly. But until 3 years ago, I had no idea of setting up my own organization. I worked for other human rights organizations around the world and was quite content to do so. But in 2011, after 5 years of trying to help someone I dearly loved escape a man who was abusive, had forced her into marriage, etc., she was failed by all the systems that we had tried to utilize, the justice system, the social services, etc., here in the UK, and she was murdered by the man that she had been trying to escape. Now, I have regarded myself as a human rights activist and a feminist, more especially since the age of 7. I have educated myself in some of the top establishments in the world. I'm lucky to say I've been traveling on my own, and I just thought it was unbelievable that something like this could happen to me and my family. And why did it happen? The questions started arising: how can I stop this? And what needs to be done to make sure that this doesn't happen again and again and again, as it does every single week in every single part of the country, and in every country of the world. And one of those things that I realized was that there's a huge gap between the organizations and the mass humanitarian agencies out there doing all these massive movements and people on the ground. There is no link there. There is a very weak link there. And when it comes to stopping crimes, when it comes to helping women, when it comes to recognizing what's going on in homes and in parts of the village or in parts of your country, it is the people that know. It is the people that will actually help people to stop to this. And that's why I set up Making Her Story. I thought if I can help one person recognize what's going on and go out there and save someone else's life, then that's me done. I can die quite a happy woman. So Making Her Story, we seek to unite people, men, women, boys, girls, across the world to actually take action in any way they can, however they can, no matter how big or small the action, to recognise what's going on, to share information, and to work with the agencies already doing work out there. Now, with regards to trafficking and abuse, both in the refugee crisis and in the UK, certain events have led us to start our works abroad. I was telling Krish the other day at another session that we had no idea that we would actually be taking on aiding refugees until October last year. And the reason why Making History started to do work in this field was because of one picture and one image, and that was of little Aylan, who was washed up ashore and whose image infiltrated the newspapers of the world. That image shocked me to my core. I remember where I was that day. I was on a bus going to a meeting in Trafalgar Square. I couldn't stop breathe. I couldn't actually breathe when I saw the image. I had to get off the bus, and I phoned up my trustees, and I said, we cannot sit back and not do anything. So we broke our agreement of working just within the UK on a physical level, and we have been going out to refugee camps in France to begin with, and we are going to expand that now. And the things that we're seeing out there are horrendous. Just as Verity said, people are stepping in where governments are failing. It is Facebook and Twitter that is our information sources. We had nothing to go on when we left on our first convoy in October. There was nothing to go on except for what was being said on Facebook. There were no agencies out there helping you to figure out what you could take, what food was needed, what clothes were needed. When you got out there and you saw it for yourself, only then did you learn, actually, okay, this is what I need to do. And every single time you go back out, you realize that just how changeable the situation is, just how changeable authorities are and laws are, and the diction around that word refugee and migration, and how that impacts how people are being helped. And with regards to trafficking, modern slavery, we can't just pretend that it's out there. Making History, we also work with an amazing organisation called Justice for Domestic Workers. There are women men and women and children being trafficked in from Afghanistan, from India, from Somaliland, from Thailand, from Russia, as domestic workers. They are promised jobs over here. They go to work in our richest diplomatic households, and they're abused and raped, and no one does anything about it. We campaigned last year with the House of Lords and the House of Commons to have these people, domestic workers, who are workers and human beings by every right, to be recognised by law. It was refused by the House of Commons. They are not recognised by the Modern Slavery Bill. So we cannot, as a country, sit back and lord over other countries' human rights laws when we ourselves do not recognise people in our country being abused right on our doorstep over here. So we work within the UK and abroad to recognise human beings as human beings with rights. And I think Angelina Jolie's speech yesterday about how that word refugees and that whole toxic conversation and diction around the word migration needs to change, because until our mindset and our views of these people as human beings change, and the racism that and the xenophobia that attaches itself to those words changes, we cannot actually move forward. And neither can we move forward as organisations and individuals. We need our governments to work together on this, and the fact that they're refusing to do so is a damnation on this part of our history and in this part of our history books. There's lots of levels that we need to tackle, but for now it's the human beings, it's the ordinary people on the street, it's the actors like Verity, and it's the people that we work with who are going out there and doing what our agencies should be doing. And if it wasn't for those people would be dying in masses right now. So it's everything. I think change is born of individuals working together, and it's the only thing that actually gives me hope in these really dark times.
Thank you very much. So, questions, thought pieces, over to you. Yes, sir.
My name is Tony Thomas. I live in Oxford. I've just come back from the ILO, which is the International Labour Organization in Geneva. It's the oldest established UN body. It's been going 100 years in 2019. And just to reiterate that there was one day given to child labour chaired Krish by a BBC lady, don't remember her name, but the figures they gave were 168 million children in child labour, of whom 85 million were in hazardous occupations, things like mining and things like that. The upside is that that number is being reduced quite substantially by means of the conventions that the ILO have managed to pass and got governments to ratify in their national laws. I don't know how many governments, but the majority of governments have actually ratified a law abolishing child labour.
Thank you. Any other points, thoughts?
It's so overwhelming. Actually, I'm totally overwhelmed by all this going on. I would really like Verity. I just think, what can I do? What can I do about it? There's very little I think I can do about it, but I just felt like she does. You know, what can I do about it? I mean, it seems an unanswerable task, but there must be something we can do. Do we have to lobby governments? Yes, should I write to my MP and that sort of thing? Yes, that's what I should do. Perhaps that's what I'll do next. Anyway.
June, go ahead.
Hi, June Jacobs. I'm just, because of this, it's not, I'm not using the shocking information, but we are having, it's just because a friend who is the head of an organization in King's Cross called Women at the Well, and her job is to look after women who mostly in King's Cross, and they're the prostitutes, but also a huge job on trafficking. For example, when we had the Olympics 2 years ago, she had meetings with the police every evening about the trafficking, because this was going on. And it so happens that in 2 weeks, I'm not proclaiming it, I don't think I'm selling tickets for it, there's a meeting in the House of Commons in the July, in a couple of weeks, about prostitution, and particularly prostitution and trafficking, but prostitution that is really used, what am I trying to say? It's forced upon them, and I've certainly, as it's in King's Cross and it's my complaints, I'm asking my MP to come to it as well, because they're very worried about what the more of it, and the Nordic, I don't know, the Nordic program, which you may probably heard of, is something that they're trying to promote even more. And the woman I met last week with Linda, who has written the book, which is going to be a part of that program, and she's called it Paid For, because this is the story of her having been forced into prostitution and for her life. So all I'm just saying, I'm not selling tickets for it, because I guess we can't, but I think that what you're doing, I hope, will be much stronger. But I mean, what you're talking about is something which we have to get, as Veronica says, governments to deal with more. But it's such a moving subject, difficult to talk about.
Unless is there another question, or can I ask a question? Okay, William. Well, William, can I ask a question, because we've heard from you, and then you can ask something thereafter. It seems to me that there is if the statistic is correct, that there's $150 billion worth of trade. There is a business model that exists for the promotion of slavery of one sort or another, and a vast proportion of that is sexual slavery. Here in this country, my understanding is that a sexual slave will have, for just taking that category, will have nothing, but will have a mobile phone. And those who have worked with, trafficked individuals who have been rescued and saved are really the first thing that, or one of the first things that they are taken aback from is the lack of awareness of the victim, of the rest of society being there for them, or his or her rights. And so one way of disrupting the business model of a trafficker is to utilize social media. Has this been thought of, contemplated properly by people? Does anyone have experience of, how this can happen, or is it because? And also, it's a very naive thing, but I could be walking down a street and I could confront somebody who is trafficked, who may not even come to me. So if there were messages, or if there was some kind of communication en masse, if government took this staggering problem seriously, or more seriously than it does, surely it can be diminished in this country. Does anyone want to speak to it? Do you, Anjali? And then I'll throw it open to the floor.
I think it's a really lovely question of you to ask, but it's also a very naive one. We work with women who have been trafficked for prostitution, and we try and aid them as best we can. But one of the key things about these women is they will not have social media on their phones. Their phones are purely for contacts between the person controlling them and their so-called clients. They do not have access to the outside world. Any attempts to do so will lead to physical violence, usually. They are completely and utterly brainwashed. They have no concept of freedom of choice. That personality that they were born with is killed out of them. They are abused to the point where they believe that they deserve what they get. They are abused to the point where they believe that their client who is coming to see them is their only source of rescuing, in the sense that these women are tied down by obligations that we're not seeing. They're usually in this trade because they are there by family ties. They are in debt, and also they're made to be dependent on drugs usually. Mm-hmm. They are ploughed with the stuff as soon as they enter the country, so that their systems are completely not their own. Now,
so just
they have no independence.
I get that, but social media has no role to play in. Not
with them directly, no. And I also think we need to move away from. The Nordic model scares me, because it tries to legalize a trade that shouldn't be legal. And I think that the fact that we're reaching this level where Amnesty have even released statements saying that to have sex is a human right is to weigh on the side of the perpetrators. I do not believe, no woman wants to grow up being a prostitute. Nobody. You can ask a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 13-year-old. No one's going to say.
Do people know what the Nordic model is? No. You would like to?
So the Nordic model is trying to convey that. Convey the sex trade as a business, as a trade where the women who are working within that trade are recognized as workers. Therefore, it is legitimizing the trade. So therefore, if they have any complaints against their abusers, against their employers, so pimps and traffickers are now being recognized as employers under this model, they have a right to go to the police and complain. These women will not go to the police against their pimps and traffickers. And what we're going to have next, traffickers filling out tax forms, I'm sorry, I don't agree with it. But the fact that we're still focusing on the woman's role in getting herself out of this is damning, because she cannot get out of it. It's up to us to make sure that the perpetrator, that business is killed off at the root. There is no demand. Until that demand stops, that supply will always be there. Until it goes for the drug trade, it goes for the sex trade, it goes for any other kind of human enslavement trade. So you have to kill it off, and that's why it has to be prevention first. We can't be focusing on how do we rescue these women afterwards. We have to focus on why is it that men are going to prostitutes in the first place, or men are believing that pimping and trafficking is a legitimate business. We have to clear that mindset, and we have to get away from this thinking where the woman has to rescue herself. She cannot rescue herself. That's why she's in there in the first place. She would not stay there if she could. Believe you me, and that goes for domestic violence and FGM and forced marriages and all the rest of it. The woman cannot be blamed, and she cannot be called upon to rescue herself. That's why she's there in the first place. So we need to focus on why it is that we have a demand there in the first place, and deal with that.
Ashley, and then yes. Sorry. Well, let's get a question, and then please.
Can I just project? Okay. Hi, I think, thank you guys so much. The panel has been really wonderful, and I was one of the ones who came just for today. Sorry. Do I just stand out? My goodness. I think that you're conflating the trafficking of women and prostitution with sex work when you're speaking about the Nordic model, which I think is really problematic within the discourse, because with the fourth wave of feminism right now, there are women in what we can deem right now as the global north who want to participate in sex work, and the Nordic model is trying to protect them who are in that position, and they want regulation for that. They don't want regulation for trafficking. And so I agree with you in that there's a potential with the Nordic model to make trafficking more dangerous, but I think its root intention is actually to protect sex workers right now who have limited rights in many regards. And so it's trying to amplify the human rights of women who deem themselves as sex workers and are coming out in that, not trying to take those away or not legitimize those who are being trafficked and forced into sexual labor. So I think there's a distinction there that's really important. And prostitution, as one of the oldest and most historic commodifications and businesses, I think that it's really naive in that point to say that we need to get rid of that before anything else. I think the Nordic model is a step in that direction, whether that's our ultimate goal or not, but it's a way to protect women right now. So, thank you.
Maybe if we can take a couple of questions, and then I'll ask you, so it doesn't become a to and fro between a single panelist. Yes, William, please.
Well, I just wanted to mention a couple of experiences, well, not experiences, but in Cornwall, where my family comes from, we had. I was speaking to the police, and they've just set up the first refuge for slavery, I believe, in Britain, in Exeter, a sort of safe house. And I said, "There's no slavery." And they said, "Yes, there is. You look at, we have problems, so many problems in our community." And they said, for a start, they're the flower pickers. And many East Europeans are brought over for flower picking. And you'd think that was fine, very good, free movement of labor and so on, but they're paid below the minimum wage in many instances, well below the minimum wage, and their passports are confiscated by their employers. So they become a kind slightly enslaved. And then the fishing industry, offshore in the boats, European boats and so on, there are migrants from other areas who are just used for processing fish and are just kept on the boats and never brought ashore very often, or you know. So there are problems, and the police in the southwest try to deal with them. And then I went out with a group from the police in Plymouth, and they were dealing with suspected traffickers in women, and young women and girls. And we raided a house. I was standing politically opposed. I went out with them when they raided a house, a special unit. They didn't arrest anybody, but they lined them up and interviewed them and so on. There were no women there at that point, so they couldn't arrest them. But these suspected traffickers, they all were Arab boys, to my astonishment, and they all claimed to be Badoon, Kuwaiti Badoon, Kuwaitis without passports. They claimed to be Kuwaiti Badoon because that meant that they couldn't be returned because they were then victims. They were asylum seekers who were trafficking, these young lads. So a most extraordinary situation, just talking about this. But that said, so there's trafficking of different kinds all over the place in this country. And that said, my question really was to Verity and to Charles Bennett. You were talking about the trafficking across the Mediterranean, either from Turkey or from Libya. Do you see, what should we be doing about that? At the moment, the European Union has sort of tried to cut it off. Do you view that as a right action? You've had then the British at some points have been taking boats to intercept boats and then take them to Lampedusa and so on. Do you view that as a right action? What do you view as the right action on the part of international governments in terms of dealing with this problem of people risking their lives?
Thank you, William. So, did you want to add on to that question?
I'd like to make a comment.
Yeah, please do.
I was just wondering whether, in terms of taking this forward, one should invite Kevin Highland, the Commissioner for the Anti-Slavery Bill, and the various...
I think he was invited, but he couldn't make it, but we did think of him. Yeah, he was the commissioner. Last year we had a commissioner for anti-slavery in this country, and
because he is very active, and he's also very active internally, because there's obviously a separate problem in the UK with regards trafficking and grooming young girls, and how prostitution comes about, as well as internationally. And I know that his role is quite key in terms of addressing this. So
thank you. I know that the panel is keen, but I just want to get as many ideas from the floor. And panel, if you wouldn't mind just jotting, and then I'll come back to you. Yes, sir.
I want to say because we talk about Syria, and I want to bring Syria matter again to here. If you think about what's happening in Jordan, Mukhayyam Zaita, the things happening there, you cannot even imagine about it. That slavery and sexual abuse, young girls, babies, they're selling them. I'm not going to say which country. Most of them, they come from Gulf. They're buying them, and they're asking most of them to be virgins. This is very clear, and I wish some attention to this camp. There's a lot of things happening, a lot of things. And secondly, we're talking about like all of the international brands. Who is responsible for slavery? It's all Western countries involved. There are hundreds of companies abroad in Pakistan and India and Afghanistan, and they're using children under 6 years old for 10, 15, 20 hours. Just I want to say it all the time, I feel embarrassed to say, but I'm going to say it. Shame on the democratic country. They can say everything and they don't do anything. Shame on all of them, really. They're calling them, the human rights, and they're talking about it. They have done nothing about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Just one fact. 80% of Ukrainians, which are living here and working actually in Europe, have Lithuanian passports. The passport costs 3,000 euro. For Russians, sorry, because they're not big, you can't buy it in Russia. You have to go to Ukraine to buy passport. For Russians, 10,000. That's why from Russia, only criminals, they use this method. They're buying these passports. But Ukrainians, most of the Ukrainians, they live and work here with the Lithuanian passports. So the same with people who are to be smuggled. And that's why this is the problem with debt. Because, and the production of the passport in Lithuania is number one source of income for the state. And everybody knows this. In Great Britain, I've spoken to police several times, but nobody pays attention. But this is actually the governmental state business, intergovernmental state business. So this is one point. And the second point is, or question to Verity. I think the most important thing what is required in this and what we can do in this field is to attract people's attention. And of course it is a surprise for me, but a pleasant surprise that actress is present here. Much can be done by production of documentaries or movies or whatever. I know I have some connection to this, but I was the participant of few films on corruption in Russia as an expert. But I think that it is important to start some campaign to produce documentaries and even movies about this problem and about refugees. And it is very difficult, at least it was like this, because I've tried to start this, but it is not possible. You can say, for example, oh, okay, let us criticize Putin, there will be no problem. But if you don't criticize Putin, but want to tell the truth or to get to the roots of the problem, nobody is interested. So I think, is it possible, the question, to organize some group of people in the film industry, in documentary, BBC or television community, to start appealing to this.
Okay, so I have lots of hands up. We're going to have one more for the time being, and then sorry, we'll have one more, and then I'll get the panel, and then I'll come back to the audience. Yes, ma'am. We'll wait for the microphone. Yeah.
Hi, I would like to ask Anjali. She said that the House of Lords, they declined to like a bill which would stop diplomats, workers, not to exploit or abuse them. I was wondering why they did that, whether it's something political. And secondly, also, I feel there are certain cultures whereby young girls are married, say even in my country, and because of dowries, you know, girls are used as a means of making money for the family who are really impoverished. So maybe it's something we need some education or enlightenment, and also cultures in the Middle East, like in Sudan also, the Arab Islam culture. Young girls are married under 16, so if not, or if the servants, the girls, they are exploited by their boss, somehow it's seen as normal because it's part of the culture. So maybe we need to have forums or platforms where different cultures can come together and, you know, and explain how, you know, girls are being victims because of some cultural practices.
Thank you. So hold your thoughts for a moment. Let's go to the panel. Verity, would you like to respond to the Mediterranean point and the other point on?
Yeah, it's an unfortunate case, really, of legality versus humanity. Unfortunately, there are no legal means for these people to reach safety, to escape the persecution, which they are going to inevitably do. I mean, the smugglers who are making, you know, 2,000 euros a pop aren't going to be thwarted by a big NATO ship going back and forth and being like, no, they're going to get through, and therefore these dinghies are going to continue to cross and people are going to continue to die, because the only option is they're going to make passage and they're going to be ways. So they need to, I mean, the Turkish need to lay on transport, safe transport. I understand that this influx is alarming people, but it is going to happen. These people are fleeing absolute dire circumstances, and I think that the answer is we need to help them pass across, and then hopefully, as the Dalai Lama says, find a means of re-establishing them, for example, in Syria, you know. But for the time being, I think that, I mean, it's 90% of the refugees have paid criminal factions to get where they are. And in fact, I think, yeah, I mean, in Europe, the biggest criminal enterprises are trafficking. And therefore, it's a booming business, and it's going to keep going unless we manage to quash it by just doing the right thing, just helping people across safely.
Thank you. Ahmed?
I just wanted to make 2 points. One is that this matter of awareness. See, each one of us has a role there. I would like to say that at least in India, what has happened is with more and more people having started to talk about it, this particular aspect of being married away with full religious norms and you know, young girls married to 60-year-olds because they are allowed more wives than one, and then they would be going on to the Middle East and other places. Now, with all the awareness, the government is stopping them right at the airports. So I think it's a great thing if each one of us wants to play their role to go on talking about it in any media possible and make it happen.
Thank you. Charles?
Thank you. I don't think you can separate them entirely, because often the root causes of the sort of human trafficking we've been discussing, and a lot of migration of the sort we've talked about more before, the same. The routes used and the processes are often rather different. The appalling state of affairs that we've heard about, not only diplomatic but other welfare households in London, of course repeated in a lot of the Gulf states, Now, in purely mechanical terms, there's a lot more that could and should be done by airlines and immigration authorities and so forth. But the change in the law here is certainly something that's appalling that we haven't managed to do anything about. On the child marriage thing, correct me if I'm wrong, but I read something not long ago that as a result of the pressures in refugee camps in the Middle East, there's been not only a massive increase in child marriage, but at lower and lower ages. I mean, I think they were talking about 12, 14-year-olds. And younger, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But gradually, not increase in numbers, but a lowering of age because of the pressures. On William Morris's point, I suppose it was the EU, but there's this rather bizarre discussion about whether to have rescue boats in the Mediterranean or not, and the idea that if you don't rescue people, then people will stop coming because so many of them are drowning. A, I don't think it works, and B, I don't think morally you can support that, in spite of what my views most people won't agree with. But on that, I think you do have a duty to rescue people when they're at sea. It's too late to persuade them not to have done it. So on that, you have to, regardless. And a lot of important work's been done mainly by small naval and coast guard vessels, including some from Britain and Ireland. But equally, there have been absurd gestures. I think it may have been Verity, I think Verity was referring to it. When the EU was doing its deal with Turkey, they said to NATO, you must send a lot of warships to sail up and down. And the Navy were confused because they didn't know what they were there for, because they were too big to rescue anything. And this was allegedly information gathering. Now, again, at a technical level, that's obviously completely useless. If you want to have intelligence gathering, and I think that is important, and should be possible in Turkey, but given the Turkish government's rather ambiguous or ambivalent stance isn't happening, it should be easy to gather intelligence on the traffickers involved. This is regardless of the overall solution, but at that level. It's more difficult, perhaps, as we heard on the first day, in Libya in North Africa, and that's something I think people are less aware of. We see hideous pictures of people drowning, but the actually much longer routes across the Sahara are, if anything, even more hideous, because people are actually treated more or less as slave traders treated trains of slaves. They're dying in large numbers. If they run out of money, they're dumped or shot. If they get ill, they're dumped or shot. There's a lot going on that we don't see. And and obviously Libya, because of the state of affairs there, it's difficult to gather intelligence on who's involved, but it can be done.
Thank you. So before I come to you, ma'am, there was the point, Anjali, on the challenge to the Nordic, or your opinion on the Nordic model. And then on social media, ironically, Pranay Shakya from Liverpool asks that if social media cannot help, can we use something to promote hotline numbers, etc.? And on that, Polaris, the respected American, you're aware of Polaris, the respected anti-trafficking charity in Polaris, says that since 2007, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline operated by Polaris has received reports of 14,588 sex trafficking cases inside the United States. So, I mean, that may not be from victims themselves, it may be from clients, it may be from other people, but I do want us to look at solutions as well, and it does seem to me instinctively that social media, there is something to be done. So, can you help?
With regards to what you said about sex work, yes, I do recognise that there is a very small percentage globally. We're talking around about 3 to 4%, I think it is, of women in the prostitution trade who recognise themselves as sex workers. It's a very tiny percentage. So for the Nordic model to kind of use that to speak for other women who have been trafficked and prostituted, I think it needs to be addressed. And I do recognise that very small, but it's very small. And I think that those women have had certain roots that most of the 90% of the women in that trade wouldn't have had. And I think that needs to be discussed. With regards to hotline numbers, for example, in the UK we have Crime Stoppers, which is you can give anonymous reports. For example, if you suspect that there's a brothel on your road, or if you suspect that there's a woman who's been trafficked in, etc., you can give that anonymously. There's also Stop the Traffic, who we work with. There are numerous hotlines, there are numerous numbers, and these are constantly given out to anyone that we encounter. But again, it's not as easy as making that phone call for a woman trapped. trapped.
Yes.
It's easier for someone outside of that system to make that call for her. She's not going to be able to do it herself very often. But it's all about raising awareness, and social media is the catalyst for that, and that's something that the refugee crisis has absolutely shown to be true, because it's united people around the world to step in, as I've said, where agencies have failed and actually saved human lives. And for example, if Verity wasn't there, on those shores, if teams of networks of people as old as 86 and as young as 4 in the Calais camps weren't there giving out hot food, there would be mass deaths on our hands right now, in the hands of our governments. So social media and raising awareness is the crucial thing. And I think that that question mark as to humanity versus legality is because we're not seeing what's happening in Syria and we're not seeing what's happening in Iraq. Social media and Facebook is where I get the kind of Al Jazeera news and that kind of the flash mobs of what's actually happening, the bombs that have killed 15 children, for example, today. You don't see it on the BBC, you don't see it on Sky News, you do not see it on our media channels. We're being protected from the truth, and because we're being protected in such a way, we do not actually understand what these people are fleeing from. For example, my very first trip to Calais, we met a professor from Damascus who was a medical professor. His wife and 2 children had been shot in front of him, and he was going to be kidnapped to be taken by an ISIS head to do surgeries on wounded soldiers within the ISIS army. He managed to flee outside of a window and make it across 20,000 miles on foot. These are real stories as human beings who are just like you and me, but we are not being told as such. We are given these labels, refugee, migrants, and that's all we're given. We're not given the actual human stories. I think media platforms and social media, for example, The Guardian does an amazing job, I think, in trying to make sure that this stays in the news. And the EU referendum and the kind of toxic nature of this discussion that's happened around immigration has again brought to light, the kind of pitfalls that await us and the history lessons that we seem not to have learnt around this crisis, the humanity crisis. So there's lots of awareness raising to do, and every single one of us can go out there and do it. There is no such thing as too small an action. There's lots of things you can do. For example, Monday was World Refugee Day. On that day, we sent out the little booklet that you're seeing right here to every single MP and said you have a responsibility to actually do more than the UK government is saying they can do. And the UK government has said they can take in 20,000 refugees over 4 years. That equates to just 2 refugees per borough or per county. During the Second World War, in 9 months, we shipped in 1.5 million refugees and gave them a home. Why is it that we're not able to do this in this crisis? Why is it that we're not willing to do this? And why is it such a big question mark? And again, I will raise that back to awareness raising and what it is that we're not being told is happening around the world. With regards to the sexual abuse in camps, etc. Now, on my last trip, I was in Calais 6 weeks ago, and it's the first time that I've been, no, actually it was 4 weeks ago, first time that I've been where I have not seen a child or woman out in open. And how many of you here have children? Okay, so you will know that when your child is quiet, there is something wrong. Now imagine going into a camp of 7,000 people, over half of which are women and children, and it is silent. There are no squeals of joy, there are no squeals, there are no crying, there is no playing going on, and they're completely invisible. It's the first time I've not been able to see a single woman and child. And it's because they are so terrified, they're not even coming out of their tents anymore. Now, when you go onto ground, when you go into the camps in Calais, when you go onto the shores of Turkey, you will not see the UN there. You will not see Save the Children. You will not see the major agencies that are saying they're doing the work. I'm sure they are doing the work, but they're not actually physically on the ground. And it is terrifying. And the statistics that we're hearing is, I'm sure, just a quarter of the picture. And in Calais recently, they built those horrific, I would call them concentration-modelled shipment family units, so-called family units. They are a window, there's not even a door, I don't even know how they get into these units. They're not allowed outside of these units, they have to stay inside 24 hours a day. No one is allowed to give access or aid to them. There's a fence there. And if you're caught, then we're shipped out of the camp. So you have, we've also heard rapes and sexual abuse perpetrated by the authorities to the families living in those family units. So this goes more than just what's happening within the camp, it goes to agency abuse as well. So there are just so many layers, and until the legality and the humanity are matched, we cannot cope with it. We don't even know where to start, and I'm just being very honest here. So going into the camp and actually not being able to help the way that you want to help is gut-wrenching, and it makes me very angry as well. So we have to lobby our MPs, because unless we all speak, there is just no way that they're going to care. Because what they care about is the votes and if they're going to get in next term. And if they feel that the people are going to say, no, we don't like you, you're not doing enough for us, then they will actually act, sad to say, except for amazing people like Jo Cox. And it's quite touching that we're here speaking about all of this as a memorial is going on her 42nd birthday today. So we need to actually put the people who are responsible for doing what we have willed them to do as a democratic nation and give them the sources and tools to do it and to listen to us. So there's nothing that you can't do, and you know you have to use your voice as much as you can. Sorry. So I've talked to the reading.
I'm going to go to the lady at the front, and then Bahani. Laura, did you have a question? Is that right, Laura? And then Aditi, did you have a question? Yeah, okay, so we'll do it in that order. But may I just ask, it sounds like what you're saying is that it's really that the main thing you're calling for is a significant raising of public consciousness on this. Like that's what you're saying. Absolutely. And that's what the gentleman there said, and you referred to you know, the films and the role of media. Danny, you're working, I heard over lunch, on a film, so maybe you'd want to tell us about that at some point as well. Well, not right now, if I can just go through the order because people are waiting to speak. So, ma'am, can we have a microphone? Thanks.
Thank you. It's honestly heartbreaking. We, as you said, we are not aware to what extent it is, but still, I cannot understand and excuse my ignorance. What exactly you want us to do? Okay. Do you want? I mean, definitely, I would support more than 20,000 family over 4 years. As much as I know what the difficulties we are going through at the moment, I would like it, but I would like to see it more organized, more proper, more, you know. But I want to go back to another topic, which is underage marriage. Underage marriage in the Middle East, or let's be honest, in Muslim countries. I mean, we have to be very conscientious, as well as the government's action regarding this topic in particular. Like, for instance, in Morocco, they have changed family status. They improved it, reformed part of it, which included that, yes, a woman should not be married before 18, and she can marry herself without a guardian, but if the guardian see it fit and suitable that she should be married, with the approval of the judge, yes, he can marry her, based on the guardians. So what I would like to see from the government here is a much more control over this in particular, this issue, whether between us here or between immigrants coming here. Two issues, they should be absolutely criminalized, and internationally, sooner or later, is underage marriage. Okay, I'd like to see the government taking a better stand, giving leaflets, explaining what we stand for in this country. I would welcome people who are willing to give in a bit as well, you know, as much as they will be taking. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to clarify, Amit, just on that point, and then I'll go to, we're going to Bahani at the back in a second. But just on underage marriage, it happens across all communities in this continent, right?
Yes, that's right. It's not only amongst the Muslims, let me tell you. It happens within the Hindus also, and it's all a demand. That's why I said that if we are able to reduce that demand with awareness and with all the other paraphernalia that goes with reducing that demand, I think we will have really made a dent into this change.
Shame of governments who allow it, such as in Zatar camp, where the Gulf people, Gulf men, comes and buy the girls.
That's right.
And the question is how long they keep them for. Have to be.
So there is, in my eyes, a global hypocrisy when it comes to this issue. And I think I have personally tried to tackle it on with imams, for example, and mosques. They play a huge role in allowing this to happen. And for example, you kind of said that men are allowed 4 wives. They're not. In Islam, it's very, very... I mean, when you read the Quran and the rules around it, it's incredible. It's actually said, advice to men that they cannot split their heart amongst the two.
And this is not a
No, but that's what they're using. But that is what they're using to marry. and that's what they're using to marry underage girls. They're using so-called religious texts and interpreting it in a certain way to allow them this freedom. And it needs to be stopped. That awareness needs to be raised, and it needs to be raised across many platforms.
But your other point was, what is it that you want us to do? So if I can ask each person, yes, in this context, so each person to think of that on the panel, and indeed in the audience, but we'll end with that shortly. But thank you very much. Sir.
Thank you, Krish. And you give a lot of hope, really, to see people like you, Anjali. Oh, okay. Well, I said it gave me a lot of hope to see people like Anjali who are working very hard.
Yes, absolutely.
And I don't think it helps also to criticize the human rights organizations which are making things public, which will have an effect in reducing it. So I think if we criticize them, we will be in fact helping the traffickers. But one thing I want to ask is, there are those who trade with human bodies as part of the trafficking. Many Eritreans from my own country were affected in places like Sinai, and they lost their kidneys. And
you mean organs?
Yes,
trade
human organs,
right,
yes.
Right. Yeah.
And what is being done about it, or what do you think can be done? Especially if governments are, it's not their allegation, there are proof that governments are being involved in this heinous trade. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura?
So my question is, how can we encourage those who are currently ignorant around human trafficking to have a better attitude toward women and sex as not just something for their enjoyment, and how to spread that message, because currently those people are not the sort of people taking part in these discussions?
Thank you. Aditi?
Thank you. As Sir mentioned about trading of organs, and someone also mentioned over there that documentary should be shown. While I was studying in Mumbai, I did a documentary on the gangs of Mumbai, how they trade with children and women, and I really learned shocking facts about it. And after my studies, when I asked one of the child on the road, "Would you like to study? I'll put you in a school." He said, "No, I want to learn." How do you change that mindset? The other time, there was someone who was working in my house, and she was humiliated by her husband. So I just asked my mom that let's put his son in a nice school and let us keep her here, and give her support or whatever we can. We put the child in the school, and after a week she leaves from our house, and she goes and collects the son back.
So referring to the naivety of someone's. So over lunch, I mean, the reason I know some of these names are because I've met some people over lunch, and I met somebody who I last met when I was 17 years old. We were at the same school together, and he's producing a film. So on the documentary point and the public raising point, Danny, would you like to tell us about your project, and maybe relevant?
Thanks, Victor. You haven't changed it. Thank you. No, that's right. So my name's Dan Parry. I've been hired by the producer David Heyman and the director David Yates to work on a film, to do just as Anjali was suggesting. I think that they agree. There's not quite the awareness of some of the issues as there could be. They are interested in producing a film that will cover will bring to attention some of the elements and aspects that we're talking about today, in particular the refugee journey. It's a cinema film for international release. These things take time. They're not always certain either. So it's a process that will take years. But I've started that process now on their behalf, and so I'm looking for stories. There are many different entry routes, entry points into this story. The shocking statistics and facts that Chris was sharing with us earlier on is one way of doing that. But for a film, we need another way, and the other way is looking for the emotional, the human story. That's the thing that will help us raise the awareness that Anjali, I think, is looking for. One way to do that is to look for those human stories, and that's my job. So right now I'm talking to as many people as I can. I've only been on the job for a few days, so I've got a lot to learn.
But thank you, Danny. I mean, I think it could be with that level of production and brains behind it, it's a very high profile.
Oh, well, I would just say, so if anybody feels that they have direct connection to refugee stories, in particular the journey, then I'll be here and I would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid, okay, your quick question, we've got to end in 5 minutes, so, but like, Sophie. Sophie back there, sorry, back there, Sophie.
Hi, thank you. So obviously there's a really large scale with issues on treatment of women, but my thought is how, when in England, where women are given so many opportunities, we're well educated on these issues, but women are still, and girls are still being looked at in a different way, and it can be as subtle as it may seem, but it's all on the same scale and it's all part of the same thing. So how are we meant to change the larger part of the scale when we have these small, well, they're not small, they're all,
Yeah, thank you. No, it's a good point. All right, so I'm afraid that's it from the floor. But can we have? Can I just go through the panel? There was a point on human organs, which is an ancillary point. There was the point of how do you raise public awareness and educate. The point on women, and the compelling point that I asked everyone to end with is, what do you want us to do, Charles?
If I could, the question of the media, if I could say something like that, I think there's a part of the problem is, you perhaps unfairly, but some extent truly, you can say that media have a limited attention span, as indeed the public. So if they had one disaster for a bit, they want to move on to something else. But there is also, to be fair to the media, a real problem in that obviously we're talking about hideous events, therefore they're dangerous, therefore even if journalists are willing to do it, often their employers aren't willing to let them go or to send them. But there is, as was mentioned, there is a lot of information there, but you have to be someone who's prepared to go and look for it. And people like Al Jazeera, but there's a lot of news on the internet, but not that most people will read. It's something you'll have to look for. I do think there's a lot more that can be done with sort of basically criminal intelligence efforts against human traffickers, both in talking about the large-scale routes and against the more specific domestic or sexual slavery routes. On the sexual slavery and domestic slavery thing, I think particularly with domestic slavery, I don't know, but I suspect not only in the Gulf states, but in London, I suspect a lot of people have if they have mobile telephones, have them taken off them. So I suspect they really are probably more isolated than most of us can imagine, because all of us think everyone's in touch with everyone else all the time. Some people really aren't in touch, and if they don't have a language that many people are going to speak, which many of these people won't, they won't have a chance. In terms of the sort of domestic and or sexual slavery trafficking, there are a lot of people, I'm thinking of a particular case in Zimbabwe not long ago, when people who weren't necessarily as appalling poverty as many of the people in India that have been referred to are, but were still desperate for work, went to what they thought were legitimate jobs in the Middle East and turned out to be sexual slavery. So there can be, I think there's a lot in public information in target countries, because some people wouldn't go if they knew what they were going for. They're not so desperate that they would actually do that if they knew what they were letting themselves into. Thank you.
So Amit next. Sorry.
Well, I'll just say I have 4 points that I follow in my own life, and awareness being the first with a big capital A keeps being the head of the charts. Number 2 is help the legislation come in. Number 3, improve the administration so that they enforce this legislation with exemplary punishment. And the last is alleviation of the economic condition of those who are prey to these things.
Thank you very much. Very good. Verity.
I think on a personal level, what we can do is sort of individuals who haven't got nearly as much say as we should have, is just put out there that these issues are important to you. So be it social media, all of this puts pressure on the public consciousness. And I do feel that if you yourself champion these things, and then someone else, a friend, will see that, and it starts conversations and dialogues that will eventually reach the higher authorities. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just touching on a few points. With regards to misogyny, which is what you're talking about, the kind of root causes of violence against women and other men, it's all about prevention and education. So one of the things that we do is we're actually going to go into primary schools and secondary schools and talk about women's rights and men's rights, and also the impact of what they're seeing on social media, whether it be pornography or whether it be what they're seeing in advertisements, and just be culturally aware of the information that they're getting fed as to the roles of men and women in society and how it is that they can actually actively tackle it as an individual. So it's very crucial we do that, and it will lead hopefully to a kind of gradual equalisation, I suppose, of how men and women and boys and girls see each other. With regards to legislation, I'm so sorry I didn't answer your question from the back there with regards to the modern slavery bill. We have to acknowledge the monetary and political reasons for why certain legislation does not get through despite the morality of what it is that we're trying to do. For example, in numerous debates with the House of Lords actually passed the motion to recognise domestic workers in the modern slavery bill. It was the House of Commons who knocked it back, the Conservative government who said no 3 times, and therefore once you've said it 3 times it goes out the window. And a Guardian journalist actually stood up in the House of Commons and said that is because the government has links with the richest Russians and the Arabs and Emirates in which household this stuff is happening. So just to give you a case study, 2 weeks ago we received a call from a woman who had been brought in from the Philippines, was chained to the toilet whenever the family left, and had been raped by both the father and the son of the family because she was seen as nothing. She managed to escape and broke her leg, and now she is in a detention centre. So she is now being punished for trying to escape the situation without a passport. So these things are happening in the richest areas of London. This was in a house in Kensington, and one of those multi-million houses that we passed by Regent's Park. So we cannot deny that political and economic factors are involved in not passing humanitarian laws, and we have to recognise that. Again, that goes back to awareness raising. And with regards to enforcing, we need, I actually attended a meeting last year held by Harriet Harman with regards to the Labour government setting up a fund for refugees. And I kind of laughed out loud and I said, look, the public don't trust the government to do anything on this anymore, to the point where we're shipping ourselves out to do what you should have been doing in the first place. The lack of trust there is huge, and that goes for the police authorities, anti-trafficking units. There is always a level of agency involved in allowing this stuff to happen, and people are aware of it and they're angry about it. So they're trying to come up with their own ways, and now actually it's their turn to listen to us. They have to listen to us as to what we're doing and the solutions we're coming up with. For example, the brilliant Airbnb scheme that's happening in Europe with regards to housing refugees, and the way that people have just broken the laws and taken them in themselves. The government now needs to actually listen to us. So cry out loud, do what Verity is saying, and speak to your friends and families about what you can do and the wrongs that are happening right here in the UK as well as abroad. And believe you me, just that one word will get someone to action it, and that's where the power comes from.
Thank you very much. Wonderful note to end on. Thank you. Good night.